There are so many reasons, especially in the age of COVID, for people to have a long running list of things that have gone wrong for them. But that list of things to be grateful for and the practice of gratitude was so critical for keeping me here. And it's the reason that I recovered as well as I did.
This is about as big as a subdural can get. It means it was the entire span of his brain.
Hi, I'm Chinna, and this is StoryTrender.
I don't take advice. Get too excited.
I moved to California when I was 28 years old. I thought, you know what, there's a boxing club in the neighborhood, and I've been curious about the sport for a long time. I like watching it, so I'll give it a shot. January 20th, 2019, I went for a sparring session, and it was a hard spar, but aside from that, there wasn't anything particularly notable about it. But about 90 minutes after the spar had ended, while I was showering, I began seeing dark circles out of both of my eyes, and I knew like something's happening neurologically. But by the time I had gotten out of the shower, I threw up, which fortunately my girlfriend was in the next room over on a work call, and I didn't have a way of reaching to her because I was losing the ability to speak. So my way of getting her attention was by thrashing on the floor loudly, and she came in to check on me. She called for an ambulance.
So a subdural hematoma, which is what Chinna had, is one of the most devastating injuries you can have. When you have a subdural hematoma, you're really in a life or death situation. Easily, the majority of patients who have subdural hematomas either don't survive or end up in a persistent vegetative state.
All the while, I wasn't conscious for very much of it. I was in and out of consciousness because my brain was bleeding, and the swelling was causing my brainstem to compress into my spinal cord. So all those brainstem functions, like how I breathe and how I regulate my states of consciousness, were leaving me. So they told me, you're not taking in oxygen well enough, we're gonna intubate you, and they put me under. I came to briefly while I was having a scan at UCLA to a room full of people saying like, don't move, you have a brain bleed, you're in the scanner right now. And I mean, I had enough time to register one thought, which was that my life is gonna be different.
We made the decision to operate when he arrived to the hospital because he was dying. The hospital records reflect that he was going downhill, and he was going downhill fast. And in that moment, the decision to operate is almost reflexive, because when someone's dying, you have to intervene.
And then I came to 12 to 16 hours later or so in an ICU to a room full of people screaming, don't move, you've had brain surgery, there's no bone. And of course I didn't know what that meant, but it turns out that in that span of 12 to 16 hours, they had removed this section of my skull because my brain was bleeding so badly that all that fluid was creating so much pressure. They needed to drain it and give my brain space to swell. And so I woke up and everything was different.
We had to do an urgent surgery, an emergent surgery, when we were trying to save Chinna's life. And when you're doing an emergent surgery, you don't have time to get cute or do small surgery. He had a big subdural, a big brain bleed that was covering his entire right side of his brain. And so what we did, without being too graphic, is we removed the skull completely on the right side of his brain.
It took a while before any sort of progress was really made. At first, there was a collective sigh of relief that like, okay, I'm alive, but I'm only awake for 30 minutes a day. I'm only awake for no more than an hour a day at first. And I couldn't move my legs. I was in so much pain from the waist down. A lot of time passed before I started to think like, okay, the absolute most impairing parts of it might be behind me. It started with the states of consciousness. At first, we were talking about how practicing gratitude was so critical for this. The first things we practiced gratitude for were like, hey, you're awake a little bit longer than you were before. You just went from only being awake for 30 minutes a day to being awake for an entire hour. And you spent that hour having conversations with Erica and your parents, and you were able to talk to your care team a little bit. Like, that's our progress that we're going to celebrate while I'm still in the hospital.
And I think if you took the average patient who has a head injury, whether it's a gunshot, car accident, or whether they fall, if you have a brain bleed that requires us to remove half the skull, I think most of those times there's significant impairment to function and there's significant injury to the brain.
What ended up being 3 days after the initial injury, the hospital physical therapy team was like, look, it's really important that we try and move you a little bit at these early stages. And so that's where some of the footage of like me taking my first steps in the hospital while people are holding me up came from. And that looks really dark when you look at it right now, but at the time, we were over the moon that I was able to walk at all, that I could move my legs, period, despite being in a lot of pain and kind of having like nerve pain, neurological issues with moving my legs the way that I used to. But that was a big triumph, and that's kind of where it started. And that's where the whole like, oh my goodness, can you believe that I could walk? Can you believe that I made it to a window today? Can you believe that I looked out the window? All these like little moments of things that we just thought I wouldn't be able to do anymore. We started celebrating that. When I first got home, my states of consciousness were not okay, and I couldn't stand up independently. I couldn't walk, couldn't do anything. It was just basically laying in bed at home versus in the hospital. Especially in the first week and a half, I needed to be bathed by Erica, by somebody else, because I couldn't stand in the shower. I had to be held up to walk. After I had kind of had some momentum going, Erica and my parents and I walked all the way to the beach, which is only a few blocks from us, but it was daunting to me, the prospect of walking in sand, because I was like, I just figured out how to walk on solid ground, and I just built up enough stamina to even get to this point of the sand. And I had shied away from it a couple of times earlier in the week, but on this one particular day, Erica was like, hey, I'm gonna bring our Frisbee with us because I think you can do it today. And once we got to the sand, with a lot of encouragement and with everybody holding their arms out to catch me if I fell, I figured out like, oh, I do have enough balance to walk in the sand. And I took a few steps and it was okay. And then Erica threw the Frisbee to me, and I like had the hand-eye coordination to catch it and throw it back, and we played catch. And in that moment, everything just clicked, and the way to use my body and connect all of my senses just suddenly fell into place. And so we went home after that walk, and that's how I figured out it's still in me. My body still knows what to do. From that moment on, I kind of took over the rehab for myself.
It's amazing that he was able to recover his arm and his leg and his function at all or so fast, given how extensive his injuries, his brain injuries, how big the clot was, and how bad his injury was.
I can see how doing Ninja Warrior wouldn't be the logical progression from a horrific boxing injury. But one day, my mother-in-law reached out and said, hey, I was watching Ninja Warrior and I saw that they're taking applications for people to go on the show. And I thought, you know what? I have a newfound life is too short to not do the things that you want attitude. And why not? Why not try to do Ninja Warrior? The story is pretty compelling and makes for good TV. So Ninja Warrior was like, hey, let's give this guy a shot. And that's when I was like, okay, well, now I have to actually learn how to do this stuff. Let me go figure it out. I had a lot of fun doing it, and I'm still practicing, but I'm getting better at this stuff the more and more that I'm doing it. And I'm really excited to keep competing, for one thing, because sports are important to me. And then two, to me, it's kind of a vehicle to get my message out that no matter what insurmountable odds you're facing, how bad things might be, I don't think I'm any different from anybody else who may see this. And if I could continue to push and recover and get a little bit better at something each day, then you could too.
I didn't succeed because I didn't get him back to boxing. I remember meeting with Chinna and his partner and talking about what to do after the injury and him recovering, and where I implored him that he cannot box again, that his boxing career is over, so he has to find other non-impactful ways to be an athlete.
Well, getting married at the age of COVID is not great, but we had an outdoor Hindu ceremony, only having a very small, like 10 people sitting in an outdoor space watching this happen. And the most important thing was that we got married, which of course you can imagine, especially after your partner ends up in an ICU and you're not married to them, you want to have the legal protection to be there for somebody in every way that you want to be there for them when you love them.
When I think about Chinna and where he was at death's doorstep, and the number of steps it took from there to get all the way to recovery, to pushing life, to inspiring others, and he should probably write a book.